They say the Appalachian Trail is a place to find yourself, but back in 1989, I nearly lost everything on it. I was a college kid then, restless, trying to prove to myself that I could survive alone in the wild. I carried only a small pack, a few rations, and a jungle hammock strung between two trees deep in the Virginia woods. It was late spring when I set camp near a quiet hollow, the kind of place where silence feels thicker than the air itself. I remember the smell of wet leaves, the sourness of damp earth clinging to my clothes. As the sun fell, the forest came alive with its chorus of cicadas and owls, but it wasn't soothing. It felt like the woods were breathing with me, inhaling every nervous thought. When I finally climbed into my hammock, I left one flap loose so I could breathe the night air. I thought I was alone. At least, I convinced myself I was. Hours passed, maybe midnight, maybe later, when I woke with a start. Something had shifted. Not a branch, not the wind, this was heavier, closer. I kept my eyes shut at first, frozen, until I felt it, the faint pull of fabric at my feet. I opened my eyes. The moon cut through the trees just enough to cast pale light, and in the corner of my vision, I saw a silhouette standing inches away, a man. His head cocked unnaturally, his breath ragged like he'd run miles, and in the dim light his teeth caught a glint when he smiled. I couldn't move. My whole body screamed to run, but the hammock wrapped me tight like a cocoon. He leaned closer, whispering something I couldn't make out, and then he gripped the hammock rope in both hands. That's when I realized he wasn't just watching. He was about to drag me away into the black woods. I kicked out violently, the hammock twisting like a trapped animal in a net, but my feet tangled deeper in the canvas. His grip didn't break, he yanked hard, and the whole world spun as my body lurched sideways. My shoulder slammed against the tree trunk and stars filled my vision. He didn't say a word, just grunted as he dragged me, the hammock scraping against rocks and roots, tearing at the fabric, tearing at my skin. The smell of him hit me, then sour sweat, dirt, and something metallic, like rust or dried blood. I tried to scream, but the hammock muffled my voice. My lungs fought for air, chest pressed tight against the canvas as I clawed at the knots. My fingernails split on the rope. I thought, this is where people vanish. This is how you disappear. For a second, I remembered newspaper clippings back at the trailhead, missing hikers, unsolved disappearances, names that never came home. My pulse hammered in my ears as I finally ripped a hole through the netting. I shoved my arm out and clawed at the dirt, grabbing a root to slow the pull. He hissed, low and angry, and jerked harder. "You're coming with me," he rasped, his voice cracked like old wood, dry and splintering. That was the first and only thing he said. Somehow, my hand closed around a jagged stone in the soil. I didn't think high, just swung backward, blind, hitting whatever I could. The stone connected with a dull thud, and his grip faltered for a heartbeat. Just enough. I ripped free, rolling out of the shredded hammock onto the forest floor, dirt and pine needles sticking to my sweat-soaked skin. He lunged, fingers grazing my ankle, but I kicked loose and ran. The forest swallowed me in darkness. Branches whipped my face, thorns raked my arms, but I didn't stop, not even when my lungs burned like fire. Behind me, his footsteps crashed through the underbrush, not fast, but steady, relentless. Like he knew I'd tire before he did. The trail markers blurred, the moonlight flickered, and I realized with a sick drop in my stomach, I didn't know where I was anymore. I had no flashlight, no bearings, just endless black trees and the sound of someone hunting me. Every instinct screamed at me to keep moving, but my legs buckled with every step. My lungs felt raw, scraping in air that tasted like copper and pine resin. The woods blurred into shifting walls of shadow and moonlight, every tree trunk a possible figure, every rustle a trap. Behind me his pursuit never quickened, and that was worse than if he had charged. He was patient, deliberate, savoring the chase. I ducked low and stumbled into a ravine, the cold air sinking deeper than the rest of the forest, damp and earthy. I crouched behind a fallen log, pressing myself against the wet bark. My heart thundered so violently I was sure he could hear it. The night was too still. Then I heard his footsteps on the ridge above, snapping twigs, steady as a metronome. He paused, and I could almost feel his gaze searching the dark, peeling back layers of shadow. My mouth went dry, my tongue heavy as I bit down on the urge to gasp. For a long moment, there was nothing but silence. Then a sound cut through the stillness. So close, I nearly cried out. His voice, not shouting, not calling, just murmuring, as if he were talking to himself. The words were broken, fragments slipping through clenched teeth. Won't. Get away. Always mine. I squeezed my eyes shut, tears leaking hot down my face. I thought of my mother's kitchen light back home, of stupid small things like the way her screen door squeaked when it opened, and I realized I might never see it again. His boots scraped against rock as he descended into the ravine. I could smell him before I could see him, the same sour rot clinging to the air. My hand groped blindly through the leaves until I found another stone, slick with moss, not much, but better than nothing. My muscles trembled with the effort of keeping still. Then a beam of pale moonlight cut across his face as he stepped closer. His eyes caught the glow, flat and empty like glass marbles. He wasn't just a man anymore. In my mind, he was something feral, stripped of all humanity, a predator moving in silence except for the rasp of his breath. I gripped the stone so tight it dug into my palm, waiting for the moment he would hear me, see me, reach for me again. I knew I couldn't wait for him to find me. The longer I stayed crouched in that ravine, the closer death crept in, wearing his boots and his rancid breath. When his steps came within a dozen feet, I did the only thing I could: die, exploded out from behind a log, stone clutched in my hand, and lunged at him. The surprise gave me one heartbeat of advantage. I swung with every ounce of desperation, the rock cracking against his temple. He staggered, cursed, but didn't fall. His hand shot out, clawing at my jacket, and I felt the fabric rip across my shoulder. I ran, no thought, no plan, just raw survival. Branches lashed my face, thorns tore at my shins, but adrenaline burned hotter than pain. I barreled through the underbrush until I saw it faintly, impossibly, the glint of a weathered wooden sign. The trail. My legs churned harder, carrying me toward the faint strip of dirt cutting through the trees. I followed it like a lifeline, praying it led anywhere but deeper into that nightmare. Behind me, I still heard him crashing through the woods, slower now, but steady, refusing to give up. The sound of him was like a disease spreading closer, a sickness that would swallow me if I stumbled. At last, through the trees, I saw a light. Just a flicker, warm, yellow, human. A lantern swaying from the porch of an old cabin at the edge of the hollow. I don't remember crossing the distance, don't remember pounding on the door so hard my knuckles split. I only remember the door opening, an old man with a shotgun in hand, eyes narrowing as he saw the terror carved into my face. I collapsed across his threshold, gasping, shaking, unable to speak. He stepped outside, lifted the lantern high, and scanned the tree line. The woods stared back, silent, empty. The man never came out of those trees. Not that night, not in the days after. The authorities combed the forest, found my shredded hammock and trampled ground, but no footprints, no body, no man. It was like he melted into the Appalachian dark. To this day, I don't camp in hammocks. Sometimes, when the wind rustles the pines just right, I hear the whisper of rope tightening and his ragged breath cutting through the night. Some people say the trail is haunted by restless spirits, but I know better. The real monsters out there aren't ghosts. They're men who know the forest better than you. Men who wait for you to close your eyes. Not all dangers on the Appalachian Trail vanish into the dark. Some have names, faces, and dates carved into history. In 1981, near Pearisburg, Virginia, to hikers Robert Munford Jr. and Susan Ramsey, both 27, set out for what should have been an ordinary trek along the White Rocks. They were young social workers, idealistic, full of purpose, taking a brief escape into the wilderness before returning to their lives in Maine. They never came back. Their bodies were discovered days later near a shelter, stabbed and bludgeoned, hidden beneath brush as if the forest itself was trying to cover up the horror. The man responsible was Randall Lee Smith, a local drifter who had grown up in that very area. Locals described him as odd, quiet, someone who never quite fit in. He knew those woods like the back of his hand, knew every ridge and hollow, every shortcut. When police tracked him down, they found evidence tying him directly to the murder's blood. Stolen gear, damning details that left no doubt. He was sentenced to 30 years, but served only 15. 15 years for taking 2 lives in cold blood, for turning the Appalachian Trail into a hunting ground. Hikers who knew the story avoided Pearisburg after that. Parents warned their children about venturing too far from town. Even years later, the name Randall Smith carried a sour taste, whispered in the same tone you'd use for a curse. But here's the part that haunts people. Most after his release in 1996, he came back. Back to the same town, the same woods, the same trail where he had spilled blood. Locals spotted him wandering the streets, shuffling past the diner, sitting alone on park benches staring at nothing. Hikers who crossed his path reported the same unnerving details. He smiled too long, spoke too little, and his eyes carried a flatness that stripped away any trace of humanity. The trail remembers men like him, and so do the people who hike it. Because a man like Smith doesn't leave the mountains behind. He waits. By 2008, most people had either forgotten Randall Lee Smith or assumed he was a relic of the past, too old and broken to pose a threat. But the mountains don't change men like him, they sharpen them. That spring, 2 fishermen, Sean Farmer and Scott Johnston, set up camp near Dismal Creek, just a few miles from where Smith had murdered Munford and Ramsey decades earlier. The men were locals, used to the backwoods, cautious but friendly. When a stranger wandered into their camp, gaunt and soft-spoken, carrying little more than a faded pack, they offered him food. Sean later said the man's mannerisms were strange. He barely spoke, ate greedily, avoided eye contact. He called himself Randy. They didn't know, not yet, that Randy was Randall Lee Smith, freshly released from prison, still haunting the same soil he'd stained with blood. As night fell, the 3 men shared fish and beans over the fire. Smith sat across from them, quiet, staring into the flames, with an intensity that unsettled both fishermen. Then, without warning, he pulled out a gun. The shot split the night like a lightning strike, the echo rolling across the valley. Scott was hit in the neck, Sean in the chest. Both men collapsed, stunned, tasting iron and dirt, their ears ringing. Smith didn't shout, didn't curse, he simply kept firing until the revolver clicked empty. Then he stood, watching them bleed out beside the firelight, just as he had watched others decades before. Somehow, by sheer will or luck, both Sean and Scott survived the initial shots. Bleeding, choking on their own breath, they crawled through the dark woods, dragging themselves away from the campsite while Smith reloaded. Each movement was agony, but adrenaline drove them. They reached their truck by the creek road, collapsed inside, and sped through the night toward help. Behind them, Smith tried to flee, stealing their vehicle, but fate had a way of catching up. He crashed the truck into a ditch miles away and was found soon after by police, half dead himself. He didn't live long. Randall Lee Smith died in a hospital bed days later, silent to the very end. But even in death, he left scars deeper than the trail itself. The aftermath of Randall Lee. Smith's final act left the Appalachian community reeling. Newspapers carried the story across the country. Trail killer strikes again after 27 years. Hikers who had once brushed off the old warnings suddenly remembered why Pearisburg had become synonymous with unease. The idea that a man could murder 2 hikers in cold blood, serve only 15 years, then return to the exact same mountains to try again it, wasn't just shocking, it was grotesque. Sean Farmer and Scott Johnston lived, but they carried the trauma like invisible scars. Sean described lying in the hospital bed, hearing the gunfire replay in his dreams. The image of Smith's hollow stare burned into his memory. Scott still bore the wound on his neck, a reminder every time he looked in the mirror of how close death had come. Locals whispered that Smith had been planning another killing spree, that the fishermen were never meant to be the last. Some swore they saw him wandering the woods in the weeks before, muttering to himself, collecting scraps of food, sleeping rough. Whether true or not, the fear stuck. For hikers, the Appalachian Trail has always carried risk storms, injuries, even bears. But Smith added something worse, the knowledge that human predators also walk those paths. Rangers posted signs urging caution. Some shelters were abandoned altogether, left to rot in silence because hikers refused to sleep where Smith had once lurked. And yet, the strangest part of his story isn't what he did, but how ordinary he appeared. Photos from the late 2000s show a thin, balding man in plain clothes, unremarkable, almost invisible. He could have been anyone you passed on the trail, anyone sitting beside you at a diner. That's what unsettled people most, the realization that evil doesn't always wear a mask or snarl in the dark. Sometimes it smiles politely, accepts your food, and waits for the right moment to strike. Even today, long after his death, hikers say the stretch of trail near Dismal Creek feels wrong. Quiet in a way that presses against your chest, as if the forest itself absorbed the violence and refuses to forget. They call it cursed ground, though the truth is simpler and darker. It remembers because we remember. When Randall Lee Smith finally died in that hospital bed, strapped to tubes and monitors, many thought it was the end of his story. But for those who knew the trail, who hiked the same ridges he haunted, his death brought no peace. If anything, it left a deeper unease. Because the Appalachian Trail stretches over 2,000 miles, through towns and forests, an endless wilderness. And the truth is, You never really know who's out there with you. Smith proved that evil doesn't vanish when the prison doors swing open. It waits, festers, and returns to familiar ground. I've spoken to hikers who still refuse to step foot near pyramids. They describe a heaviness in the air, a silence too sharp, as though the woods themselves are holding their breath. One man told me he walked past the shelter where the 1981 murders happened and swore he felt someone following, a presence just outside his peripheral vision. When he turned, nothing, only the sway of trees, but the feeling stayed with him for miles. Others leave small offerings near dismal creek stones, stacked in quiet cairns, flowers pressed into bark as if to pay respect to the lives shattered there. And then there are the stories that never make it into the papers. Campers waking to find bootprints circling their tents. Strange laughter drifting through the trees at night. A figure glimpsed at dusk, thin and hollow-eyed, watching from a ridge before slipping back into shadow. Most chalk it up to nerves, to imagination twisted by the isolation of the mountains. But when the trail has carried real blood, when it has known men like Randall Lee Smith, can you really separate fear from memory? That's the danger of places like the Appalachian. Violence sinks into the soil, lingers in the roots, becomes part of the air itself. Smith may be gone, but the dread he left behind remains. And maybe that's the most terrifying part of all. Because when you sling on a pack, lace your boots, and step into that vast wilderness, you tell yourself you're walking a trail through nature. But some trails aren't just dirt and rock. Some trails are scars. Scars don't heal. They remember 6 bodies, 1 farmstead, and a mystery that has haunted Germany for more than a century. The Hinterkaifeck murders. March 31st, 1922. The farm sat isolated in the Bavarian countryside, surrounded by dark woods and fields that stretched to the horizon. That night, something unspeakable unfolded inside its walls. Andreas and Cecilia Gruber, their daughter Victoria, her 2 children, and the maid, Maria Baumgartner, one by one, slaughtered. The weapon, a mattock, sharp enough to split bone. But the horror was not just in the act. It was in the details. The killer or killers did not leave immediately. For days, smoke curled from the chimney. The cattle were fed. Meals were prepared and eaten in the kitchen, while 6 corpses lay hidden in the barn and house. Whoever committed this massacre didn't vanish into the night. They moved in. Neighbors only discovered the crime when the family missed church and school. When they arrived, they found the animals restless, the farm oddly tended. Then, the bodies. For stacked in the barn, covered with hay. The maid in her room, little Joseph in his cot, his skull crushed. Investigators were baffled, and what they uncovered only deepened the dread. In the weeks before the killings, the Grubers spoke of strange happenings. Footsteps in the attic. Newspapers no one in the household had bought. Keys vanishing. A broken lock on the tool shed. Andreas dismissed it, all until it was too late. Theories swarmed. Was it a neighbor with a grudge? A stranger passing through? Or someone who had been living inside the house all along, hidden above the family in the attic, watching, waiting? The farm was remote. The family disliked. Rumors swirled of abuse, incest, and bitter feuds. Motives weren't hard to imagine. But no suspect was ever convicted. Witnesses contradicted each other. Evidence went missing. The trail went cold. To this day, the Hinterkaifeck murders remain one of Europe's darkest unsolved crimes. A house consumed by blood, silence, and secrets. The farm was torn down in 1923, as though the land itself wanted to erase what happened there. But memory doesn't vanish with bricks and timber. It lingers, like footprints in snow, pointing to a killer who was never found. The first suspect was Lorenz Schlittenbauer, a neighbor who had once been romantically involved with Victoria. He even claimed to be the father of her young son. Joseph Lorenz was among the men who first discovered the bodies. And what he did that day still unsettles people. He unlocked doors, moved through rooms with a strange calmness, and handled objects as though he knew the layout too well. Some thought he was trying to appear helpful. Others whispered he was staging the scene. But investigators lacked proof. Then came theories of a stranger passing through Bavaria, perhaps a vagrant, who killed and stayed only for shelter. Yet why tend the animals? Why cook meals? Why linger? It seemed too personal, too deliberate. Others speculated it was someone hiding in the attic long before the murders, explaining the footsteps, the missing keys, the cold draft of someone unseen moving above. To imagine a figure crouched in the dark, listening to the Gruber family below, biding their time, is almost more terrifying than the murders themselves. Some whispered that the killer was not outside the family at all. The Grubers were notorious in the village. Andreas was said to be abusive, strict, feared by many. Rumors swirled of incest with his daughter, Victoria. Was this a crime born from inside, one of vengeance or desperate escape? Investigators interrogated family, neighbors, acquaintances, but every lead ran dry. The matic was never traced, the murderer never caught. The case files thickened with contradictions, sightings that could not be verified, confessions that crumbled under scrutiny, details that pointed in every direction but never landed on certainty. The most haunting part wasn't just the killings. It was the days after, the smoke rising from the chimney as though life inside continued. The neighbors who saw signs of movement but didn't think to investigate sooner. The animals fed, milked, the barn kept. It suggested someone who didn't just want the family dead but wanted to step into their existence, if only for a few days, like wearing the skin of another life. It was control, domination, a performance of belonging in a home that had been silenced by blood. The Hinterkaifeck murders remain unsolved, and that void of certainty is perhaps the most horrifying element. Was the killer a scorned lover, a stranger who vanished into the forests, or a shadow that lived among them for weeks before striking? The farm is gone, but the mystery lives on, whispering in the dark corridors of true crime. A reminder that sometimes the most terrifying killers are not the ones who vanish after the act, but the ones who linger. The aftermath of Hinterkaifeck was chaos wrapped in silence. Hundreds of villagers, investigators, and onlookers came to the farm, moving through the blood-stained barn and trampled yard, contaminating evidence with every step. Forensics was primitive, photographs blurred, fingerprints useless. And by the time the dust settled, the crime scene was more spectacle than investigation. The bodies were examined in Munich, their skulls removed and sent for study, but no answers came. Worse still, the skulls vanished during World War II, lost forever, as though the dead themselves were robbed of their voices. The farm was torn down within a year, its stones scattered, its land left bare, but the memory lingered. Neighbors whispered about the Gruber's sins, the strange noises in the attic, the ghostly presence of a killer who lived among them. In time, the story became less about who did it and more about the creeping dread that someone had been there all along, walking the rafters, staring through cracks, listening to laughter and arguments in the rooms below. For the police, the case was a humiliation. They named suspects, cleared them, reopened files decades later, even called in criminal profilers in the 1970s. Theories pointed at Lorenz Schlittenbauer again and again. But with each reopening, the same problems remain: no physical proof, no confession, only shadows. Some believed the crime was ritualistic, tied to rural superstition, a cleansing of a cursed family. Others believed it was vengeance, carefully planned and executed by someone who knew their routines. The chilling detail of the animals cared for, the fire lit in the stove, and the food eaten in the kitchen kept clawing back into the conversation, refusing to be forgotten. To imagine someone sleeping in that house after committing such brutality is to confront a psychology most of us cannot comprehend. It wasn't panic. It wasn't flight. It was patience. A willingness to exist in silence among the dead, to take nourishment and warmth while 6 corpses lay nearby. That is what lingers most about Hinterkaifeck. Was more than murder. It was possession. Someone didn't just end lives, they took over their world, if only for a few days, and left the land scarred by dread that has never healed. The failures of the investigation, the loss of evidence, the erasure of the farmhouse, all of it ensures Hinterkaifeck will never be solved. Instead, it remains a wound, a story told in whispers, and an image carved into memory, smoke rising from a chimney over a house of death. As if life carried on when life had already ended. A century later, the fields where Hinterkaifeck once stood are quiet, but they are not at peace. Travelers who walk the land claim to feel an oppressive weight, as though the earth itself remembers. Locals avoid the spot, calling it cursed ground, a place that swallowed a family and their secrets. No farmhouse stands there, no farmhouse stands there, no lines of what once was. Yet every retelling of the murders keeps the shadow alive, a reminder that evil can be patient, meticulous, and faceless. The crime has become a myth of modern folklore, inspiring books, documentaries, even films. But each version only circles back to the same unanswerable question: who could commit such an act and linger with such calmness afterward? Theories still surface today. Descendants of the suspects continue to defend or accuse. Arguments stretch across generations, and online forums obsess over tiny details of the crime scene photos. Some insist the family's dysfunction and cruel reputation finally caught up with them, that vengeance walked through the snow that night. Others insist the killer was a stranger, a drifter who relished the chance to disappear again into the forests of Bavaria. But the most terrifying theory, the one that refuses to let go, is that someone was already inside, living above them in the attic, their presence revealed only in hindsight through the missing keys. The footsteps in the night, the unease that Andreas Gruber ignored until it was too late. To imagine months of silent watching, waiting, eating scraps, listening to every word, that possibility feels like the embodiment of human fear. The Hinterkaifeck murders are no longer just a crime, they are a story of dread, of how thin the wall is between the safety of home and the terror of intrusion. It forces us to confront an ancient fear that our walls cannot always keep out the darkness, and sometimes the darkness is already inside. When the farmhouse was destroyed, the villagers hoped to erase the memory, but erasure never works. What remains is an open wound, a question with no answer, a silence where 6 voices were cut short, and the chilling image of smoke curling into the grey Bavarian sky. Proof that someone else lived in that house of the dead, feeding animals, stoking fires. pretending for a brief and ghastly moment that the home was their own. It was Father's Day weekend, June 14th, 1969, when 6-year-old Dennis Martin vanished in the Great Smoky Mountains, and the Appalachian wilderness has never let go of his name. His family had gone camping near Spence Field, a high grassy meadow where the trail dips into thick, endless forest. Dennis was playing a game with his brothers and other children, hiding in the brush to jump out and surprise the adults. The moment was playful, ordinary, innocent. But when the children leaped from their hiding spots laughing, Dennis did not appear. His father, William Martin, called for him, expecting the boy to pop out with a grin. Silence. Minutes passed. Then an hour. Then night began to fall over the mountains. The search started immediately, but the Smokies are unforgiving. Dense undergrowth swallows sound, rugged ridges cut off sightlines, and storms roll in without warning. Within hours, Dennis was no longer just a boy hiding. He was gone. The search grew into one of the largest in national park history. Thousands of volunteers, Green Berets, FBI agents, park rangers, all combing the woods. They found footprints, but they were conflicting, some belonging to Boy Scouts, others perhaps too large. The rain came, washing away tracks, erasing clues. Helicopters scanned from above, dogs searched trails, but the mountains yielded nothing. His father scoured the terrain, calling his son's name until his voice broke. The fear wasn't just that Dennis was lost. It was what else those mountains might hold. Weeks passed. The official explanation was that Dennis had become disoriented and succumbed to exposure or accident. But whispers told a darker story. On the very day Dennis disappeared, another family reported seeing something strange miles away. A figure moving swiftly through the woods, carrying what looked like a child over its shoulder. Authorities dismissed it as unreliable, but the rumor never died. Some claimed it was a wild man living deep in the Smokies, unseen by the civilized world. Others whispered about something even older, a predator hidden in the folds of the Appalachians. Whatever the truth, Dennis was never found. The Great Smoky Mountains are beautiful, but they are also vast, untamed, and merciless. Dennis Martin became one of their secrets, and the unanswered question of what happened to him still hangs heavy over Spence Field. Some say the woods remember, that the trees hold echoes of a boy's laughter cut short, and the shadow of something moving just out of sight. The search for Dennis Martin became a frenzy, with over 1,400 people scouring the mountains at its peak. But the sheer number of searchers may have doomed the effort. Volunteers trampled over potential evidence, leaving behind a chaos of footprints, scents, and noise that drowned out the faint traces of one small child. Days turned to weeks, and every hope ended in frustration. At one point, searchers discovered child-sized footprints leading toward a stream. Some barefoot, some with shoes, but officials dismissed them as belonging to Boy Scouts. Others swore they could have been Dennis's, washed away by the rain before confirmation was possible. His family refused to leave, clinging to hope, searching every ridge and hollow, their eyes burning from lack of sleep. Rangers warned of bears, bobcats, and snakes. But what haunted them more were the stories surfacing from the edges of the case. One family camping nearby claimed they had heard a scream in the woods around the same time Dennis disappeared. A shrill, panicked cry that cut through the trees and then fell silent. When they reported it, it was folded into the chaos of conflicting witness accounts. Then came the most chilling report. A man named Harold Key and his family, hiking miles away in the Cades Cove area, swore they saw a rough-looking man darting through the forest, carrying something limp and small over his shoulder. When the Keys learned of Dennis's disappearance later, they believed they had seen his abductor. Officials dismissed it, saying the timing and distance didn't fit. But doubt lingered. The Great Smoky Mountains were known even then to harbor drifters, hermits, and those who wanted no part of society. Could Dennis have crossed paths with one of them? The FBI became involved, unusual for a missing child in a national park, and rumors grew darker. Some believed Dennis had been kidnapped and trafficked. Others whispered of feral people in the mountains, isolated families who lived unseen, preying on the lost. Still others clung to the simplest explanation that Dennis wandered too far, became trapped, and nature claimed him before help arrived. But if that were true, why was not a single piece of clothing, bone, or trace ever found? The Smokies give up their secrets reluctantly, and in this case, not at all theories filled the void. But the fact remained. Dennis Martin had vanished into the woods as though swallowed whole, leaving behind only questions that still echo through the trees of Spencefield. As weeks bled into months, the search for Dennis Martin dwindled, and the Smoky Mountains swallowed the evidence with their usual cruelty. The official line was that Dennis wandered off and perished from exposure, perhaps slipping into one of the endless sinkholes or caves that dot the terrain, places so deep and concealed that no searcher could ever hope to reach him. But those who lived near the park knew the mountains held more than accidents. For generations, locals spoke of wild men and hidden clans, feral families who survived off the land, living in shadows, striking fear into anyone who strayed too far off the trail. The Key family's sighting of a figure running with something over its shoulder refused to die. The FBI's presence, rarely seen in such cases, fueled suspicion that more was known than was shared. Park officials insisted it was coincidence, but whispers spread like wildfire that something had been covered up, something too grim for the public to know. Rangers who searched the deepest hollows told of unease, a sense of being watched from the tree line. Some admitted hearing faint movements paralleling them in the underbrush, never close enough to see, but close enough to know. The forest is alive in the Smoky Sound's echo. Shapes shift, but for men hardened to the wilderness, to confess fear was unusual. The case became a specter over every missing person report that followed. Each disappearance was compared to Dennis's, each lost hiker measured against the unsolved mystery of a boy who vanished in daylight while surrounded by family. For the Martin family, the pain never healed. William Martin, Dennis's father, was haunted by the decision to let his son play, to watch him run into the trees and never return. He walked those woods for years, always hoping, never finding. His face weathered, his voice broke, but the question never faded: what really happened on that mountain? For some, it was a tragic accident. For others, it was evidence that the Smokies are not just wilderness, but a labyrinth, hiding things too terrible to name. The disappearance of Dennis Martin became a legend whispered to campers and hikers, a warning that even in the daylight, surrounded by family, you are never truly safe in the Appalachians. The mountains do not forget, and sometimes they do not give back what they take. Decades have passed since Dennis Martin vanished, but the Smoky Mountains still carry his name like a scar. The official search ended long ago, yet the case is retold every summer to new hikers. A cautionary tale wrapped in silence and dread. Campers who pass through Spencefield say the meadow feels wrong, too quiet, as if the forest itself remembers the sound of a child's laugh suddenly cut short. Some have reported hearing faint cries in the night carried down from the ridges, always just beyond reach, always fading when approached. Park rangers dismiss such stories, but they cannot erase the legend that has grown around the disappearance. The mountains are vast. They say accidents happen, children wander and are lost. But the deeper truth is harder to shake, that sometimes what vanishes in the Appalachians is not claimed by nature, but by something far more human, something that knows the folds of the land better than anyone else. The key family sighting of the man carrying something small and limp remains the most chilling piece of the puzzle, brushed aside by authorities but never forgotten by those who studied the case. If it was Dennis, then he did not simply vanish, he was taken. That single possibility transforms the story from a tragedy of wilderness to a horror of predation. The Appalachians are filled with abandoned cabins, hidden hollows, and caves that stretch for miles. A child could disappear into one of them and never be found. If he was carried off, perhaps he lies in some forgotten crevice, sealed by stone and silence, a secret the mountains will never release. For the Martin family, the wound remains open. His father, William, carried the guilt to his deathbed, tormented by the belief that he should have done more. His mother clung to hope long after the rest of the world had moved on. Today, visitors leave flowers and tokens at the site, small gestures of remembrance for a boy whose story has become part of Appalachian folklore. The Smokies are breathtaking, but they are not tame. And the case of Dennis Martin endures as a reminder that in the wilderness, innocence can be swallowed whole, leaving nothing but whispers, rumors, and an ache that outlives generations. The mountains keep their secrets. Dennis Martin is one of them. Christmas Eve, 1945, should have been a night of warmth and laughter for the Sodder family, but instead it became one of the strangest and most chilling mysteries in Appalachian history. George and Jenny Sodder lived with their 9 children in a 2-story home in Fayetteville, West Virginia. That night, 5 of those children would vanish without a trace. The fire broke out just after 1 a.m., flames racing through the house as George and Jenny and 4 of the children escaped into the freezing night. But the 5 others, Maurice, Martha, Louis, Jenny, and Betty, were trapped upstairs. George tried desperately to reach them, climbing walls, breaking windows, even attempting to scale the house, but every effort failed. His ladder, usually resting against the house, had vanished. His trucks, parked nearby, refused to start. Neighbors tried to help, but the fire consumed the home in under an hour, leaving only smoldering ruins. By dawn, the Sodder house was gone and so were the 5 children. Authorities declared the children dead, their bodies reduced to ash in the blaze. But Jenny refused to believe it. She scoured the ashes herself, her hands blackened with soot, searching for bones, teeth, anything that would prove her children had perished. There was nothing. Experts later confirmed that human bones do not burn completely in a house fire, especially not in less than an hour. Something should have been left. But there was nothing, no remains, no evidence. The ground where her children should have been was empty. The strangeness didn't end there. Phone lines had been cut before the fire. Witnesses recalled seeing strangers parked nearby, watching. One woman swore she saw the children in a passing car that night. Another claimed she saw them days later at a tourist stop, accompanied by adults who refused to let them speak. George and Jenny began to suspect the unthinkable, that their children had not died in the fire at all, but had been taken. Rumors of kidnapping, revenge, and conspiracy began to swirl. and the sodders became consumed with uncovering the truth. The official story was a fire, but the deeper story was a disappearance wrapped in silence, suspicion, and dread. The Sodder children were gone, and the flames may have been nothing more than a cover for something darker. In the weeks after the fire, George and Jenny Sodder refused to accept the official explanation. Too many details did not fit. The missing ladder was later found tossed in a ditch far from the house. Their phone line had been cut, not destroyed by fire, suggesting someone had severed it deliberately to prevent them from calling for help. And George's trucks, well maintained and reliable, had mysteriously failed to start that night, as though someone had tampered with them. Witnesses soon came forward with unsettling accounts. A local bus driver reported seeing fireballs thrown onto the Sodder roof shortly before the blaze, possibly explaining how it spread so quickly. Another woman claimed she saw the 5 missing children inside a strange car driving away as the fire raged behind them. Others swore they had seen the children alive in the days following, traveling with adults in nearby towns, looking frightened but unharmed. As suspicion grew, George and Jenny began to believe the fire was no accident. They suspected arson, part of a plot to abduct their children. Their suspicions were not unfounded. George, an outspoken Italian immigrant, had clashed with local members of the Italian community over politics, particularly his strong criticism of Mussolini. Some believed the fire and the disappearance were an act of retribution, carried out by those who wanted to silence or punish him. The idea of a mafia connection surfaced, a chilling possibility that placed the children at the center of something far larger than a simple house fire. The police, however, closed the case quickly, declaring the children dead and the fire accidental. No proper investigation was launched into the possibility of abduction. For the Sodders, this was a betrayal, a dismissal that only fueled their determination. They began their own search, chasing leads across the country. Jenny kept the ashes of her home untouched, certain the truth lay buried there, certain her children's bodies had not been consumed. George traveled, questioned, spent money they did not have, all in pursuit of a thread that always seemed to unravel before it could be grasped. What began as tragedy now felt like conspiracy, with the Sodders standing alone against a system eager to forget. Their children were missing, but no one else seemed willing to believe it. For George and Jenny, the horror had only begun. Years passed, and the Sodders transformed their grief into obsession, refusing to allow the world to bury their children under the ashes of that night. In 1950, they took the extraordinary step of erecting a massive billboard along Route 16 near Fayetteville, a haunting landmark that displayed the faces of the 5 missing children. The billboard became both a shrine and an accusation, screaming into the face of a complacent world. Where are they? Who took them? WHY? For decades, that billboard stood as an unyielding reminder that this case was not closed, that the fire had not ended with 5 deaths, but with 5 disappearances that tore a family apart and consumed their lives. The Sodders chased every lead with relentless determination. They followed reports of children resembling theirs across the country, Kentucky, Florida, even New York ways, arriving too late or discovering that the child was not theirs. One story told of a woman in Florida who insisted that the children were hers, only for George to arrive and be refused entry to see them. The authorities siding against him, treating him as a nuisance rather than a grieving father. A letter arrived years later with a photograph of a young man who bore a striking resemblance to their missing son, Louis. On the back of the photograph, cryptic words were scrawled: Louis Sada. I love brother Frankie, Illil boys. A 90132 or 35. The message seemed like a cruel taunt, a code pointing to something just beyond comprehension, a puzzle without a key. Jenny kept the photograph pinned beside her bed, staring at it each night, asking herself if this was her son reaching out from the shadows. But the authorities dismissed the letter, just as they dismissed every lead, branding the Sodas as delusional, as parents unable to accept the harsh reality of death. The community grew uneasy with the family's persistence. Whispers spread that perhaps George and Jenny were clinging to fantasies, but those who knew them understood that something was wrong, something unfinished, something that smelled not of burnt wood and smoke, but of secrecy and corruption. The children had vanished without a trace, and the institutions meant to protect them had turned away. For the Sodas, there was no escape from this endless maze of unanswered questions, only the haunting sense that someone, somewhere, held the truth and laughed at their suffering. By the 1960s, the Soda family's pursuit of the truth had become both their purpose and their curse. The billboard along Route 16, weathered and worn but still glaring down at travelers, its faded faces staring like ghosts from a time no one wanted to remember. And people driving past at night swore those children's eyes seemed to follow them, accusing, pleading, eternal. George and Jenny aged, but never surrendered, hiring private investigators, writing to newspapers, even traveling themselves to track down rumors that always dissolved into nothingness. George, in particular, grew restless, pacing the house at night, unable to sleep, replaying the night of the fire in his head, how quickly the house burned, how cold the fire was when he touched the ashes, how bones should have been there but weren't, how the phone line had been cut before the flames even started. He told anyone who would listen that this had been no accident, that someone had taken his children, that the fire was a cover, a curtain pulled over a crime. Jenny, meanwhile, became a figure of quiet obsession. She wore black every day, a uniform of mourning, and kept a garden around the site of the old house, flowers blooming where her children's rooms had once been, each blossom a fragile memorial. At night, she confessed to friends, she still heard footsteps on the porch, children's laughter faint and distant, as if the missing five were trying to return but couldn't cross the divide. Then came the photograph, the one that would torment them until their last days. A grown man, the spitting image of their Louis, sent from Kentucky with a strange coded note. Was it a cruel joke, or was it proof? They sent the picture to the FBI again, begging them to investigate, but the Bureau declined, claiming the case was not within its jurisdiction. George pinned the photo beside the children's images on the billboard, a silent prayer that someone, someday, would recognize him. Yet no one ever came forward. And so the Sodas lived out their days in that strange twilight between grief and hope, a twilight that grew heavier with every year until George died in 1969. His last words to Jenny whispering of the children, of finding them, of not giving up. Jenny carried the weight alone after that, the house filled with shadows, the billboard still standing, the questions still burning hotter than the fire that destroyed everything.